What happens when the person you brought in with prayer now has to leave feeling under pressure? In the corporate world, terminations can feel simple and even cold, but in ministry, it's never that. It's the strange space between being a boss and being a brother, stewardship and love, clarity and compassion. And so today we're talking with John Melcon, an attorney who didn't set out to be an attorney. He served in Christian higher education, and he sat in the shock of losing a role that he thought he would have for a long time coming, and then found a calling to help churches and ministries navigate employment and conflict without losing their soul. We are going to talk about the real differences between ministry employment law and the marketplace, why courts often take a hands-off posture with religious leadership, and why getting it in writing doesn't have to mean lawyered up and loveless. We're going to look at practical tips on succession, NDAs, when to invite Christian conciliation, and how to talk about your last day on your first day of ministry so people feel protected and not blindsided. If you're facing a hard staffing call, if you're worried about culture erosion and when someone exits, or if you're the one who's been told today is your last day, this conversation gives you a path that protects people and preserves purpose. Welcome to the Life After Ministry podcast. Well, hey, welcome to the Life After Ministry podcast. My name is Matt Davis, and I'm here with somebody I never really thought that I would have a podcast with, John Melcon. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be here.
You have the great distinction of being the very first attorney that we have ever had on the podcast. And so first of all, thank you. Do you have any really great attorney jokes for us?
No, I don't, actually. I should probably have those in my back pocket. My kids love jokes.
There is something about what's the difference between a lawyer and a snake in the road, and something about the brake marks leading to the snake, right? So,
right.
Anyway, but it's interesting. I want to get into a couple of things with you. I got to hear a talk that you gave. I think it was at the CLA conference.
Right.
And so I got to loiter in the back of the room, and then we met each other for about a minute, and I said, we got to talk. And so here we are. We're having that conversation.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because when we started Ministry Transitions, and it used to be called Pastoral Transitions, but really kind of expanded the Christian kingdom, the world of Christian nonprofits. You, as an attorney, I would say the attorney and HR world was a big impetus for us wanting to start. And I think it was a little bit naive on my part to think obviously, you're not the enemy, but it felt like there was something in the legal world that there was so much risk mitigation that we'd taken the heart and the spirituality of the thing. And so we used to say, right off the bat that, organizations would be very elder run, very prayerful when they brought somebody in, and on the way out, it was the lawyers and the HR folks were in the room and they were the ones kicking everybody out. And so I wanted to walk through some of that because there is a tension, especially in the ministry world. It feels like, in corporate world, this just happens and you get canned and, pack your box, you're out of here and security will escort you out. And I want to see if we can make room for how can we actually do both of these well, because you could be all heart and then leave your organization at risk. So those are some of the things that we'll get into as we have this conversation. But before we do that, you have an interesting background. We both went to the same seminary, missed each other by a year. We're at Talbot out there in California. But you went from there into a ministry position. So you actually have an interesting background going from ministry into the ministry of being a lawyer. So give us a little bit of that story.
Yeah, sure, Matt. I think this is going to be a great conversation. Hopefully I represent the profession well, but you're exactly right. I didn't set out as a teenager or as a college student even to, be a lawyer. That wasn't even on my radar at all. I really was on the ministry track. After high school, I went to a Bible Institute for a year that became 2 years, transferred to a Christian college. And after that, was an intern at a local church in Los Angeles for a couple of years, really trying to just get a feel for local church ministry. It was a small church, less than 100 people. So it was just me and the pastor, right?
Yeah.
I got a little bit of everything. And it was at that time, I was like, I want to get some more training. I went down to Talbot, was doing their philosophy of religion program, and ended up working in Christian higher education for about a decade. Right. I realized local church ministry wasn't my calling, but I still wanted to kind of be in that broader ministry world and really love, even to this day, Christian higher education had a profound impact in my own life. So that was an area where I wanted to serve and give. So I was in a director level role with a team of about 10 people and had been in that role about 2 years. And I don't know if this applies in other ministry contexts, but especially in education, a mentor of mine had explained to me, your first year in a role like that, where there's this annual cycle to things, you really have no idea what you're doing, right? You're just trying to figure out what's coming at you that first year.
Yep.
And then the second year, you probably overcorrect. And the third year is really when you hit your stride.
Yeah.
So I was finishing up my second year, kind of just getting to that point, felt like, okay, we've got this great team here. We were trying to really take a sort of long-term view of the things we were tasked with, really committed to prayer. I made that a big priority for our department. And I was looking at people, one of the neat things in Southern California, all these Christian colleges and universities, there's a lot of camaraderie there. So I got to know people that were in my role at other Christian institutions. And some of those folks were men and women who've been doing that for their whole career. They were 15 years older than me. And I thought, maybe that's it. Like, maybe that's what God is calling me to. And I really got to be dedicated to this type of role, learn it well, do it. And I even told my wife, so this was about 10 years ago, right around this time of year. And I said to her, I think this is what I'm going to do. And I think it's going to really take 8 or 10 years to get really good at it. And within probably 2 or 3 days, I got called up to the executive vice president's office. And I just wasn't expecting this at all. Right. I mean, it was early in the morning. I had a yogurt. I was eating a yogurt and went in there just thinking we were going to have a conversation. And I was removed from that role. So it was a total shock to me. I thought so one of those situations, I'm sure a lot of folks that you work with feel, I didn't have a fair shot, didn't have a full chance really to flourish in the role. But, the Lord is sovereign, and I understood that. And thankfully, the school allowed me to stay on in a different role, which turned out to be a huge blessing. I know that often doesn't happen in transitions. You got to immediately find something else to do. But I was able to shift into this kind of back office role, which not only gave me an opportunity to really sort out what's next, but also to be around some other folks in the institution. And I worked closely with 2 other men, also named John, oddly enough. So 3 of us in this little department named John. Both of them, were old enough to be my dad, and just faithful, godly men who just welcomed me in and poured into me, and sort of gave me the space I needed to process through this. They kind of knew I probably wasn't going to stick around for that long, but I was essentially committed for a year. And it was during that time, I was like, well, yeah, Lord, what's it going to be? I mean, I was considering everything. I remember one of my pastors saying, maybe you should be a firefighter, right? I mean, it could have been anything, but that's where law came on the radar. I just happened to be in a seminar at a conference where I had been representing the school that summer, where a lawyer came and spoke, and he was speaking about, legal issues that were impacting Christian institutions. And I found it fascinating. There were more of those conversations happening. This is kind of the era of Prop 8 and some of these other things going on in California. So, we're confessional institutions. So you're just thinking about what are those legal threats and challenges that are going to face organizations like that. And I realized that could be an area where I could put my ministry experience, even in the church context and the educational context, working at Christian camps, together with, go to law school and learn the law and try to help serve these institutions with, those challenges. So
I'm curious for you, because you're eating yogurt in the morning thinking, I know what the next 8 to 10 years of my life looks like. You've had this conversation with your wife, and really the bottom drops out on that. Like, was there ever a moment where you said, well, I guess I'm going to still do that, but it's just not here? Or how do you start rebuilding? Like, you had a softer landing, but like the air has been taken out of your lungs in that situation. And it's an interesting moment, because you go to school and maybe even grad school thinking like, I know what I want to be when I grow up, right? Which is always the question we're asked, like, when you're 5 years old, I want to be a firefighter or something like that. But you don't realize at 5 and maybe even at 25 that question might be a little bit elusive, and you're going to have to keep asking yourself that question at different seasons of your life.
No, that's exactly right. And I did have that softer landing, which was a huge blessing. But yeah, it was a matter of just starting to talk to people who knew me, right? Too, right? The pastor I mentioned, other folks, of course, my wife, right? What's going to be next for us? And that was a really gradual process. It wasn't like the next day I thought, I'm selling the house and we're going to law school. I mean, it took several months, I would say, to reach that conclusion, maybe half a year before I actually realized, this is a huge change. Because even early on that process, I thought, well, can I just kind of keep working a sort of low stress, non-leadership job in Christian higher ed and go to law school at night and do it that way, but realize, that's going to take forever. and so, those are just the kind of decisions you work through over time. But I will say that another factor for me is, even though I really was spiritually and mentally committed to that, I was willing to do that for another 8 to 10 years. There was a part of me also that was like, would I go back to school? Would I do something in higher ed, right? At some point, you probably want to get a doctorate, even if you're on the administrative side. So going back to school wasn't I didn't feel like I was necessarily at the end of that road already. So that helped. And I think ultimately part of the conclusion was, if I stayed in Christian higher ed sort of proper and did a PhD or a doctorate in education, that might take longer. There's some other challenges there where the law degree really fit my own personality. I'm a very analytical person, right? So part of this is just taking account of our own interests and gifts and what's going to work well. I knew that was going to be a better fit for me. Once I found out about it, again, I wasn't like a round lawyer. So I'm kind of, God, why didn't you tell me about this sooner? Right, Maybe I would have gone straight to law school. But again, God has his way of doing things. And I think having that background has enabled me to be a better lawyer and serve ministry organizations, sort of with more knowledge and experience that I would have had if I had gone sort of straight to law school.
Yeah. So is our kind of assumption and the stereotypical mindset surrounding lawyers, now that you're in it, right? Like, is that true? And especially, as a Christian lawyer, like, how does that, what does that look like for you today? And even just that process, like, you went into this, you're not thinking like, this is going to be like, I'm in the courtroom, and you're doing a different kind of lawyer. So maybe give us a sense of that. Like, what kind of lawyer are you, and what does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
One thing I learned, Matt, is that there are just so many kinds of lawyers. I mean, when people come to me now and say, I'm thinking about being a lawyer, like teenagers, I often tell them, right, one of the things about the law is you could do so many different things. And there absolutely is the stereotypical lawyer. And there are TV shows about lawyers and all that kind of stuff. But there are so many people who are lawyers who are doing it differently. I think for me, so I also, again, taking into account my interests, my gifts and abilities, I see myself more as an advisor. Of course, there are a lot of lawyers like that who never go to court. I do litigation, but it's not the main part of my practice. It's something we learn from.
Mm-hmm.
But there are lawyers in my firm, in any firm, who would use the word fight to describe kind of what they do. We'll fight for your rights, that kind of a thing, right?
Yeah.
Even Christian lawyers. And that's great. We need those people. You'll never hear me use the word fight to describe what I do. I just don't see it that way, right? If we do have a dispute, if we have a conflict, like I want to resolve that. And if there are some rights that need to be vindicated, I got to do that zealously if I need to for my client. I have an ethical obligation to do that, a professional obligation to do that, but I don't consider it fighting, So I wanted to find a place where I could primarily serve in an advising role. I see what I do as enabling clients who are primarily religious ministry organizations of many shapes and sizes, denominations, and so forth, to carry out their mission without getting derailed by some legal challenge or hurdle, right? That's my sort of kingdom contribution. And so I try to look at, even before all of this transition happened in my own life. Matt Perman has a book. What's the name of that? It's on my shelf somewhere. But really what he talks about is having a life, and he's not the only one, obviously, but having sort of a life mission and purpose that shapes all that. So I tried to work through that to really hone in on serving in these, in sort of ministry organization, Christian higher ed in particular, especially at the time. And so I still see what I do as, in some ways, a continuation of that mission. It's not a change in mission. It just, my day-to-day looks different now that I'm a lawyer.
I'm curious, when you're looking at the law, what are some of the laws that are maybe more specific, or what are the differences between laws that apply to ministries versus laws that apply to the secular marketplace employers?
Yeah, so when I eventually joined the practice where I am now, I was sort of given the option of what my focus be. We've got a team here that work with ministry organizations, but we each kind of have our niche. And for me, I was drawn mostly to the employment side. And that is an area where there's distinctions in terms of the laws and protections that apply for like a religious nonprofit as opposed to just a general nonprofit or business or something like that. And the reason for that is primarily our country's commitment. And I know we may have some listeners in other parts of the world, but here in the United States, this First Amendment concept of free exercise of religion and disestablishment, right? That our country is founded on these rights that people are free to practice their religion and believe what they want to believe. There are limits, and that we're not going to have an established government church. So those principles are reflected in statutory exemptions and court decisions across the board. And when it comes to employment issues for ministry organizations and for churches, it really is, you could describe it, I think, as a hands-off approach from the courts and the government. Because for a judge, like an elected or appointed judge, to come in and tell a church or a ministry organization that no, it was wrong for them to let this pastor go, or this priest, or this rabbi, or whatever. Like, now we've got the government meddling with who a religious community wants to be its leaders.
Right. Over doctrinal differences or something like that.
Often that, yeah. And so we can think of other types of examples too, like church property disputes and so on. So it's not just, are we going to hire so-and-so or not for a pastor? But that is sort of one of the core areas. I mean, I think when it comes to religious protections for ministries and churches, the pinnacle of that in the law is that the government cannot get involved with disputes about religious leadership. So that's a great protection. Like, we want it that way. The flip side of that is, for a pastor that's been removed or something like that, there's there's not going to be legal recourse in the courts. And we could debate whether there should or shouldn't be, but ultimately, like, that's a societal commitment we've made. There may be other recourse in some respects, but it's not going to be in civil courts. That doesn't mean people don't try it. I deal with cases where the argument's being made, and sometimes it's a closer question, I guess, depending on what, it doesn't mean we can't have a dispute, for example, about who owns what intellectual property or that sort of a thing. But that is a sort of fundamental protection that exists in the law here.
When it comes to transitions, can we talk about this? We have there's just differences in how this works, right? So in the marketplace, if you have an employee that's not working out, you sit down and you can say, today's your last day, you're done. And you can still be nice about it, right? You can still care. You can still give a severance package. You can be very generous with all of that. In the ministry world, you can be both nice and you can be a jerk about it. But there is this and I say it's the tension, or it's the parable between the boss and the brother, because in the ministry relationship, we're not just somebody's boss. When I was an executive pastor, and so you wear lots of hats, right? Like, you're in charge of finances and the giving and how the staff, gets along with each other. But push comes to shove, at the end of the day, if you're somebody's boss, there's a stewardship and accountability for how you are caring for and stewarding those resources, including that person having their position. But the weird part is, and it's not that in the marketplace you don't have friendships and care about people that you might have to let go, but there is this ministry thing. There's this we will be known by our love. We have some kind of governing biblical principles that kind of undergird, and it feels like that is at tension with common HR practice and legal guidelines of risk management and protection for the organization. And there are times where I hear stories and it feels like that person who was being let go got the short end of the stick, and it was all about how the organization was told to protect themselves in that moment. What does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful question, Matt, and I think it's a challenging area. What I tell ministry organizations overall is you should approach personnel matters like anything else that you do, which is to say it should be driven by your mission, your beliefs, and your values, right? So we have to start there. And if we realize instead that the policies we have, the decisions we're making aren't consistent with our mission and values and beliefs, instead they're being dictated by a third-party HR vendor that 99% of their clients are not ministries, or an attorney that doesn't know how to work with that, right? Yeah, that's a problem. That doesn't mean those legal things aren't going to come into the picture, but they can't be the driving factor. That has to be the mission and values. And so I totally get it, right? Yeah, I come from the ministry world where we talk about it as a family, right? We're not just colleagues in an office or some enterprise with a profit motive. There is that deeper bond. And so we had to take that into account. And in fact, a lot of the religious liberty protections that exist in the law are maximized in the context of religious communities. So yeah, there are protections for your individual worship, I suppose. But really, if you look at the case law in this country, it's focused around religious communities. And because communities have this interpersonal bond and dynamic that is much like a family. And so it's sort of, these things go together, right? We want ministry organizations to embrace this idea of you are a community, not just an organization, a corporation. Technically, they're a corporation, but they're more than that. And so there's protections that come from that. But it also makes navigating a separation a little more challenging. I think a wrong response would be sort of a level of loyalty to people that doesn't properly account for poor performance, misconduct, complaints that have been raised. Like, we have to take those things into account. I think there are some ministries that are too reluctant to ever let somebody go, and things fester, problems, right? So that's not because they're so afraid of, like, well, yeah, it's just in the corporate world, you just give people the pink slip, and we don't want to be like that. So there's this overreaction to, like, we're uber loyal to people to the point of we actually don't accomplish our mission, right? So, and a lot of what I get the struggle, and it's hard for me now because I'm so conditioned to see, for example, like legal sounding language in a severance agreement. That's very familiar to me. So it doesn't strike me as lawyering up, because I look at that and I think, yeah, we got to be precise about this. And I don't know any other way to be precise than sometimes getting it in writing. And there's a lot of commas and colons and numbers and indentations, whatever, because that just makes it precise. And I know one day a judge might read this, and I need him to be able to understand it, right? A contract is nothing new, right? We have these covenants and agreements even throughout the Bible. So the idea of people parting ways and having a written agreement about how that's going to look, I don't think we should view that as, yeah, that's just from sort of the lawyer HR world, and we never want to do that. No, like, sorting things out in writing as early as possible is almost always wise, right? And in fact, a lot of what I get called in to do, and this may be going in a slightly different direction from your question, is, we're called into these situations where, like, we've kind of already reached the end of the road on a relationship or something like that. So it's like, hey, I'm meeting with this person tomorrow. I need a severance agreement, blah, blah, blah. And at that point, we don't have an opportunity to speak into, like, we're counselors, yes. Like, I view that as part of my role. It's literally what lawyers are called sometimes. Right. Yeah. So I'm happy to give counsel if that's what a client wants on some of the practical issues, even some of the ministry issues, if they want that. Like, I'm not going to, I think I know where my lane is primarily, but when we're called in at the last second, there's not much else we can do except focus on those. Okay, like, you've already made this decision. I might not think it's a great decision, but I have an obligation to my client to, help them in their interests. Really, it's ideal if we can be involved much earlier in the process, even to the point where, like, when relationships are formed, right? What are the policies? What's in that employment contract, if there is one, especially if we're talking about key leaders who maybe have their own reputation, their own brand. In today's world of social media influence, you've got sermons out there, videos, whatever. There's a lot of value that people bring into ministry leadership role that we need a lot of clarity at the beginning, kind of on the assumption that this isn't necessarily a permanent relationship. I think a lot of times ministries go into these, whether it's a partnership with an individual leader or another ministry organization, think, oh, this is great. We're all super excited about this. This is going to last forever. And the reality is I'm involved in too many situations where it's not working out for whatever reason. As much as we might not wish to end up in that place, it happens. And so being able to anticipate that on the front end, then I think it makes it a lot less painful when the separation occurs. Kind of we know how this is going to go a little bit better. We've worked it out when everybody was not so antagonistic.
Right.
And so, and it's a lot less costly. Frankly, I'm in a couple of situations right now where I think, if these ministry organizations had just talked to a lawyer 5 years ago when they put this venture together or whatever it is, we would have been able to document some of these things and brought clarity to it, to the point where now it would have been kind of straightforward. We wouldn't have the disputes we have now because those disputes arise from a lack of clarity. It could be a bylaws thing, whatever it is, that we could be clear on earlier on really helps things work better when, for whatever reason, that transition has to happen.
Yeah, we talk a lot. And I think it's Dennis Prager, actually, who says that I prefer clarity over agreement, right? And so how do we make things clear from the get-go? But we also say that you should be talking about your last day on your first day. And if we can actually go into some of these things, I want to build a world where, but that we could actually, we talk about succession and thinking about what's next as a really great form of discipleship. If you can actually start having conversations like, well, where are you going? What do you want to do? What's the timeline on that? And start to think, if we could all think of ourselves as interim pastors, right? That I'm not here forever. One day I'm going to be gone, because then you get towards the end of the line and it's time, and now nobody wants to have the conversation. And it's just a much better thing for us to be able to say, we're going to bring you in with love and grace and honor. And when the day comes that we have to separate, we want to do it the same way. And I think that's not only healthy and good for the church at large, but it also is helpful for your organization, because other people are watching, right? There's always key stakeholders involved, and people are watching. How we say goodbye matters, and how we say goodbye and let people go, it matters. You could spend all of your time creating a really good culture and have fun days and picnics and stuff like that as a staff. But if you're a jerk on the way out, then everyone's going to say, well, that's my, I dread the day that's coming, but I know it's going to come at some point, because I just see that's how we do it here in the culture. And it starts to eat away at the trust, where now I don't feel as open. I have to protect myself, because you never know when you're going to get called in. You're just sitting there eating yogurt and they're going to say, you're done.
Yeah. And that is the challenge, right? It can feel, if an organization is bringing on a new leader and they say, okay, we got to have this employment contract, we're going to negotiate all this, it can feel like a lack of trust right from the beginning. And I realize the challenge of that, but I think we need to embrace some of that as just, we're thinking about each side's protections. We have to have, like you said, Matt, this mentality that nothing is forever here. There's going to be the case where somebody is a pastor of one church for 40, 50, maybe 60 years, right? That's the extreme exception.
Yep.
And it doesn't mean that everybody that doesn't make it for 40 years, did something wrong, or that somebody sinned somewhere along the line, right? That could be okay. It could be healthy. Organizations go through seasons and so on. And so do we as leaders and Christians. So yeah, I think, I don't know the right way, but I think I want to frame it as, this isn't a lack of trust. This is just building in a way to help everybody to move into that next chapter or season in a way that honors the Lord, honors the other party, and allows all of us to continue doing what God has called us to do, even if we reach this point where we're not necessarily going to do that locked arm in arm together, right?
Yeah. Sometimes, I'm sure you see this, sometimes things end in a dispute, that you don't have agreement on that. You think of passages like Matthew 18, and how do we handle that? What does the dispute in the legal world look like for us in Christian organizations?
Well, so that brings up this kind of whole area of Christian conciliation. And I'm sure you and listeners are familiar with some of those, Peacemakers Ministries, Ken Sande, and there's other organizations, Relational Wisdom 360, Ambassadors of Reconciliation. Some denominations have in-house, if you will, reconciliation teams or leaders or manuals and so on. I really do think that approach, which I believe is intended to sort of reflect Paul's instructions that people in the church should be able to adjudicate your disputes, right? He's calling out the Corinthians for that. Why are you going to the secular courts? It's not a great testimony And people in the church are smart too, right? You should be able to sort out these disputes. He's not saying you're not going to have disputes.
Right.
He's saying you people in the church, find the right people in there. And the same in the Old Testament with Moses, and he appointed people to help sort out the disputes. And of course, taking into account God's commands, biblical principles. So I am a believer in the Christian conciliation process, which is intended to take into account Matthew 18 and so on in the process. And there's no like one perfect way to do it. It's going to be shaped depending on denominational structures and that sort of thing. Yeah. I will say the process only works if both sides at the time really want to use that. So sometimes we'll see in contracts, even employment contracts, a Christian dispute resolution clause. There's a place for those. I try to approach those as always optional, because sometimes you have a situation where there's a separation or conflict, whether that's with an individual leader or just between two organizations or what have you, where somebody's faith is really shaken and they're not in a position right then and there to maybe trust and embrace a Christian dispute resolution process, and forcing that on them, I don't think does any good. So it really has to be voluntary, not just at the time that we sign that kind of a clause, but also at the time that we would engage it. So there are people who are out there, they're trained in Christian conciliation. You want to find the right person. I think one of the challenges sometimes can be finding a Christian conciliator who really understands if there are specific laws at issue. For example, you might have a dispute, I've seen this, between a church and a contractor, like a construction company. Sometimes it's a Christian-run construction business, right? And they're coming to do the church, and they have a conflict where, so there's some construction law principles we probably have to take into account. So we're probably not going to just use a pastor to do that dispute, right? At that point, there's some legal issues that we need somebody who maybe has some experience. Same thing if it's intellectual property, copyright type stuff. So you got to find somebody, but there are people out there that do that. And so it is sad to me when churches end up in court, like in secular court. I just think that rarely works out well. It rarely is a good testimony. Perhaps there are exceptions, but I just haven't really seen them. Often my role in these cases, because I do have clients that get sued and brought to court, whether it's for an employment issue or something else. And typically my first job is get them out of court on religious liberty grounds, which isn't to say there's no other way to resolve the dispute, right? We're not trying to say, we're invincible here because of some First Amendment protection. So we're allowed, therefore, to mistreat people. It's just saying, okay, we can work this out, but secular court is not the place to do it.
Yeah. Man, I have so many questions, and I want to make sure I'm not crossing over into my own personal legal advice. But here's a situation that we get oftentimes is to NDA or not to NDA. I just talked to somebody yesterday coming from a larger megachurch and got let go right then there, zero warning. And if you want your severance package, you're going to need to sign this NDA. And so sometimes it feels unfair, and I understand. I'm just curious from your perspective, what does that look like and best practices when it comes to that?
Yeah, a great question, Matt, and certainly one I've thought about a lot as in the legal context as a whole. I mean, outside churches, just state laws that deal with NDAs have, in a lot of states, including Colorado, where I live, made those like it's sort of they're disfavored more and more in the law as a whole. And then in Christian circles as well, whether it's through podcasts, magazines, what have you, right? I think we've seen a growing conversation, or at least a couple of years ago, about these, right? Should Christians ever be using an NDA? I don't know that there's one perfect rule. Where I would start is like, not all NDAs are created equal. So I do deal with that sometimes. People are like, oh, I'm never going to sign an NDA. Well, did you read the one that was presented to you? Because it may not be what you think it is. Again, it's like, well, the lawyer is writing this trying to have really precise language, and our eyes glaze over as we're trying to read it. But it's probably trying to do something very specific. So, for example, like a lot of times the NDA, if you can call it that, is really just about what's in that severance package, right? That you're not going to go post on social media that you got $100,000 for this, right? So it may just be limited to sort of the terms and conditions of the document that you're signing, as opposed to you can never say anything about your work here or anything that you thought was mistreatment. In a lot of states, that kind of an NDA is against the law, right? You can't prohibit, if people feel, for example, that they've experienced discrimination, then a number of state laws, like to try to muzzle people from talking about those kind of issues, would be illegal. So you won't see those kind of clauses, I think, as much going forward as you might have seen them in the past. And so, but I just think often a mutual confidentiality agreement, and related to this would be non-disparagement. It's a little different than an NDA, but they go hand in hand in many cases. A mutual kind of confidentiality agreement, a mutual non-disparagement agreement, is really in both parties' interests, right? And in that case, why wouldn't we have that? In some cases, it could certainly be the sort of stereotypical, we're trying to suppress bad information, protect our reputation, even though we really did things wrong. Like, we should not be doing that. But that, I don't want to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater and say we can never have a confidentiality agreement, when in reality, it might be what both sides want for good reason.
Yeah. There's a lot, and I'm sure we say the same thing with every transition. There's no two that are alike, right? You see 1,000 transitions, you'll see 1,000 transitions. And so I'm sure such is the case with a lot of the people and the folks and circumstances that you're dealing with. And so, man, I love this, and we're going to have another conversation, I'm sure, soon. But I'm thankful. You are not the enemy, which is good, but that we really need some voices of reason and clarity in these conversations when we're talking about issues in the church, right? And through our lens of transition and employment or not employing somebody, these things are important. So we always want to be able to say, yes, absolutely, like do what's necessary to protect the organization, and to do it with love and to do it with care. Those are not mutually exclusive when we're looking at that. You're part of Taft Law. If somebody has a question, this has stirred something for some organization, they want to dig in a little bit different or a little bit deeper with you, what does that look like?
Yeah, I just Google my name or John Melcon lawyer, I'll come up. Because like we're saying, Matt, I am with Taft Law, but who knows? Who knows when to transition? I'm not planning to go anywhere anytime soon. It's a great spot for us. But if somebody's listening to this 3 or 4 years from now, my LinkedIn will be up there. People can reach out to me anytime. I'm happy to help with questions and talk to folks.
That's great. Thank you for being here on the Life After Ministry podcast. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
So what we just heard from John is simple, but it's weighty, right? Our mission and values must drive our policies, not the other way around. And clarity is not a lack of trust. It's actually how trust survives transitions. A written agreement doesn't have to be a muzzle. When done wisely, it limits confusion and not compassion. And succession isn't suspicion, it's really discipleship. When conflict comes up, Christian conciliation offers a distinct biblical way through that aims for resolution without having to make everything a spectacle. We can say goodbye in a way that matches how we said hello, where we can honor the person, we can guard the flock, and we can keep the mission going where it's supposed to go. If this episode helped you, then share it with a board member, a pastor, or a friend who needs language and courage for a hard moment. We'll see you next time. This is the Life After Ministry podcast.